Well, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Well, it's wonderful to see everyone here today, and I want to thank the organizing committee for Unite for Sight for having such a fantastic conference. I know that I'm learning a lot from all the speakers and from all of you, so very glad to be here today to talk to you about the art of the patient narrative and how you can use narrative to enhance diagnosis and clinical care, and how you can transform policy with this as well. So in my talk today, I'll be speaking about why narrative is so important, talking about the use of narrative in clinical care and advocacy. Then I also want to give you 8 tips to carry with you. I know we only have 20 minutes, but we'll get our 8 tips and the lessons learned at the end as well. So what would a talk be with narrative where I don't tell some stories, right? So I want to tell you 3 quick stories to begin our time together. The first is of a gentleman named Jerry, who is in his early 40s, works as a car mechanic, and goes to his doctor because of chest pain. His doctor hears that he has pain somewhere between his belly and his neck, and so says, okay, we have to make sure this isn't a heart attack. And so he goes to get his blood drawn, he gets EKGs, he gets blood work done. After all of this, the doctor says, congratulations, you don't have a heart attack, you have chest pain. And so Jerry says, but I don't understand, I came to you with chest pain. If you only had heard, if only the doctor had heard that Jerry had been moving heavy boxes, he was sore in his legs, he was sore in his arms, he was sore in his chest as well, maybe the doctor would have made the diagnosis of muscular strain, rather than having him go through all kinds of unnecessary testing just to be told he doesn't know what happens at the end. So doctors have to listen. The second story is of Danielle, a college student. Maybe some of you guys in this room will relate to this story. She's 21, for the purposes of the story at least, and goes to the doctor because of a splitting headache. She has this headache, though, after she went out drinking the night before with her roommates. And her roommate had just turned 21, they had a bunch of shots, a lot of wine, beer, you guys get the picture. And she wakes up in the morning with a pounding headache. Lips are dry, feels lightheaded. You know where I'm going with this, right? She has a hangover. But the doctor says, you have the worst headache of your life. So I'm going to get a CAT scan of your brain, and I'm going to do a spinal tap to make sure you don't have meningitis or bleeding your brain. And now Danielle is really scared. She doesn't know what to do. Is she going to disagree with the doctor? And so she gets really scared and doesn't know what she should do next. Now my story number 3 is of Sandy, who is a woman in her 40s who comes to her doctor because of feeling run down, feeling short of breath, having a cough for several months. And her doctor says, oh, you work as a school teacher, you probably have a virus. But Sandy knows that this is not how she normally feels. But she listens to her doctor, doesn't really question her doctor, and so goes back to the doctor in a month or so, still doesn't feel any better, and the doctor says, well, now I think you're just depressed, so take some Prozac. And this keeps on happening. And basically, it's not until a year later that she finally gets diagnosed with breast cancer that's widely metastatic. Metastatic to her lungs, to her brain, to her liver, to her bones. And I'm use this story to illustrate that it's not just about unnecessary testing and the cost of healthcare, but it's also about consequences to real people as well. So that's the use in clinical care, and I'll come back to these 3 stories. I want you to keep in mind Jerry and Danielle and Sandy. But I used to work as a journalist, and I had the great opportunity to work with Nick Kristof from the New York Times. I won his winner trip contest back in 2009, or 2007 rather. And and one of traveling with Nick, I had a lot of amazing stories. But one of the things is his perseverance. He was looking for a story on illustrating the health effects of war. People always write about war as in the health effects. They go to people getting killed in war, and finding people who are infected with various diseases as a result. But he wanted to do a different take on the health effects of war. And so we went from village to village to look for these stories. And the way that he approaches things, normal people just wouldn't do. So he would go to a village and say, for example, who here has died as a result of conflict in the last 2 weeks? And they would say, well, nobody in this village, but the village down the way, a lot of people just died. And he would say, okay, let's go that way. I think most normal people would say, if people just got killed in that village, I'm going the opposite way. But he was a very persistent person. I learned a lot of lessons from him. And what I want to do now is to share one of the things that he writes about, which is the Rokia experiment. I'm sure some of you in this room will be quite familiar with it. Basically, this is asking, who in these 3 scenarios would you give money to? Would you give money to 7-year-old Rokia, who is a starving girl in Mali? Would you give money to tens of millions, hundreds of millions of starving Africans? Or would you give money to 3 starving children in Africa, one of whom is Rokia? Well, the vast majority of people will give money to Rokia, but they won't give money to tons of people, and they won't even give money to 3 people. And that illustrates, again, that people, that we, all of us as human beings, that we relate to stories. We connect to individuals. It's not numbers that make a difference. Nick also wrote about the Darfur puppy. And he was writing about Darfur for quite a long time and was writing about what was happening in Darfur. In the same issue that he wrote about the genocide and people getting killed, in that same issue in the New York Times, there was a short story about a puppy that was stranded on a cruise ship. And that was the #1 emailed article in that issue. And people gave a total of $45,000 to try to save this puppy. And so Nick wrote about, what if Darfur were cute and it was fluffy and had like cute little ears? Save the Darfur puppy. Again, this is not a pleasant side of human nature that we like to think about, right? But we know that people, all of us, we're helpless with numbers, but empowered with stories. And so I want to tell you again the why in terms of narrative in clinical care. So think about why narrative rather than asking a bunch of questions is a good idea. So I don't know how many of you are healthcare providers in this audience. I'm a physician, so this is what I think about a lot. But a lot of times in medicine, think about if you're a clinician, when you treat patients, or if you're a patient when you last went to the doctor, your doctor probably asks you a lot of questions. But think about this. Let's imagine that you haven't seen an old friend for a long time. And you run into them on the street and you say to them, how are you? How have things been, right? You ask them kind of an open-ended question of how they are. What if instead of asking them for their story, you said to them something like, oh, did you finish high school? Did you finish college? Are you married? If you ask them a number of yes/no questions, you'll get answers. They'll look at you funny, but you'll get some kind of answers. But you won't get nearly the richness of answer as if you just asked them, how are you? What have you been up to all this time? Right? The how and the why are so important. And the same in clinical care as well. We know that it avoids misdiagnosis and medical error. We know that 80% of diagnoses can be made just based on the patient's story. That's really powerful. So if doctors aren't listening to their patients, if you as a person don't feel like you're being listened to, how are you going to get the right diagnosis? We also know, too, that telling a story builds trust. And narrative is part of the healing process. It's part of the diagnosis and part of the healing as well. Now, also, narrative is used in advocacy. So think about this thought experiment for a moment. Think about the last time that you went to a talk by a politician or a journalist or something, and think about how they begin their talk. Let's take just the politician, right? They're trying to convince you to vote for them, why healthcare is important. They don't say, oh, $2.7 trillion spent on healthcare, 30% of it is waste. That's just boring, right? They'll begin with a person from their town who suffered some kind of misdiagnosis. They'll begin with a person, just like an everyday person that they know who had an issue with insurance being denied or something, right? That's how they'll connect. And that's no different from what all of you guys do. So many people in this room, I know you guys are advocates and activists and leaders of various groups. And I know that you use story in your work all the time, because that's what connects. And so it helps to put a human face to numbers. You can say all you want about the shootings that happen, but what do people do, right? They talk about, the First Lady just talked about Haidia, the 15-year-old girl in Chicago. We know that Gabby Giffords and her husband, they talk about her experience as a way to put that human face on numbers, because that's what we connect to. And people relate to stories. And we know also that storytelling is inherent as part of our culture. It's something to say, well, Rwandan genocide happened, but something else, I think, to say, this is a story that actually occurred. This is a person who was actually affected. And we are selfish, so make it personal. And so I want to spend the rest of my time then on giving you my tips. My first 3 tips on how to get the story, right? If you want to tell the story, you first have to get the story. You have to hear the story. You have to listen to it. So how do you do that? My first tip is to be open. So don't focus on the chief complaint. If you're the doctor, you're the clinician, and you're asking a patient a story, to say that somebody has chest pain, somebody has headache. Yes, that's an inherent part of how we hear a story and how we relate in medicine, but it also cuts us off prematurely. So keep your eyes open, right? Keep your ears open. Don't just say this person has chest pain and therefore we have to do all of this stuff. Think about what that story actually means. And then don't write the story before you start. That's one of the key mistakes in journalism, right? Determining your story. But be open. The second is to listen, really listen. There's a quote in traditional Chinese medicine that I like a lot, which is that you have to listen with your whole being. And I really like that idea because it's saying you're not just listening with your ears, right? You're also looking, you're also experiencing. And it's another way of being open. I like to do this exercise with medical students that I teach, which is called no questions asked. Basically taking a whole medical history without asking a single question. My students initially look at me like I'm crazy. They say, how is this possible? I have to ask, if somebody has chest pain, I have to ask, when did it start? And how bad is it on a scale of 1 to 10? You know what is that going to tell you? Does it really matter if the chest pain started at 10 or 10:30 in the morning? Does it really matter that it was a 3 out of 10 versus a 5 out of 10? What if that patient has said to you instead, my pain was so bad that I couldn't walk from my bed to the bathroom? Isn't that better than saying my pain was 10 out of 10? Right? How much does that tell you, right? So encourage your patients and encourage the people that you're getting stories from to really not ask questions and to just listen to what they're saying. Don't assume is my third tip. Don't assume. So I was at a talk in Boston talking about my book, When Doctors Don't Listen, a few weeks ago. And it was a long auditorium, pretty dark at the back. And there were some spotlights shining on me. So I couldn't see very well the people in the back as I can today. And there was a woman in the back who raised her hand and asked me, what do you see when you see me? I didn't know. I couldn't see anything. So I was like, I don't really see much. And so she walked down to the front of the auditorium, stood in front of me and said, what do you see when you see me? I still didn't know what to say. I mean, I'm pretty short. She was my height, so I was like a short woman. I don't know. And she was in her late 60s, and I didn't know whether I should say a younger woman, an older woman, so I just didn't really say anything. And she said, I'll tell you what you see. You see an old woman. You see someone that if you let me talk, I'll wax on, and I'll never stop. And I'll tell you that I know that's what you see because that's what my doctor sees when he sees me. And that's why he never listens. And that was really poignant, right? Because I understand how something like this can happen, right? I understand how you as a patient go in and they see you as, a 40-some-year-old woman who has vague complaints and therefore you're depressed. Or they see you as an older lady who probably just keeps on talking and so I'm not going to listen. And so we all make assumptions like this every day in our lives. And again, human nature. But be careful. Be careful. As a clinician, it leads to misdiagnoses. As a storyteller, you're going to get the story wrong. So be careful. All right, now telling the story. Now that you've gotten the story, how are you going to convey it? Well, my first tip, my most important tip probably in all of this is to start with why. Start with why. Simon Sinek does a great TED Talk about why it's important to start with why. Sinek, S-I-N-E-K, if any of you want to watch it. But it's about why, what connects you, right? So if you have a product to sell, you can say things like, well, this product, this computer has this many megabytes. I mean, I'm not a tech person, so I'm probably saying this wrong, but this has this many gigabytes of whatever memory and space, and and it weighs 2 pounds, and that's why you should buy it. That's not why we buy things. Think about what Apple does. Apple says, we are really cool. You will be really cool if you have our product, and that's why you need this, right? It doesn't give you the technical specifications. It doesn't say, we've been around for this many years, and that's why you should trust us, right? It talks about why you need their product. So start with why. And then tell a good story. Learn about telling a good story. You know good storytellers when you see them, right? I mean, storytelling is such an inherent part of our culture and who we are that we know what good stories. So do things like paint a picture, build in an element of surprise, use chronology. Don't just skip around because then people are going to get confused, right? So look at people who you really admire and learn from them about how to tell a good story and practice that. Related to people's lives. Think about your 10 o'clock news. I think looking at your local news is actually a really good way to get better at relating to people's lives because news, by definition, is pretty selfish. It's all about, they're about to go to commercial and they say, learn about, how to prevent, how to make sure you don't fall prey to foodborne illnesses, or norovirus is all around us, and how do you avoid getting norovirus, right? It's not talking about the statistics of norovirus, not about people in Oregon, 5 people in Oregon died of this. It says, how can you avoid being the victim? So learn about that aspect of relating it to people's lives, because ultimately we are all selfish, so we're related to people's lives. Using an analogy can help. I'm Chinese, and in Chinese culture, we have lots of different quotes, lots of different types of statements, and so that's something that you could adapt to, whether it's your own culture or something else. Use an analogy, and then make it count and really aim for impact. End whatever story you have with, here's what you can do to make a difference, right? Now that you've convinced people of your why, tell them what they're going to do at the end. Look at my website, buy my book, join this organization. Something at the end that's tangible that people can do. So tricks and pitfalls. Consider your target audience. I mean, obviously, this is something that we all know, but just think about considering your target audience and then learn from others. I had the privilege as a result of promoting my book to talk to Diane Rehm and to be on a number of shows with really excellent storytellers. So learn from journalists and clinicians and investigators and lawyers, right? This is something that we use in so many different professions. And so learn from other people in their fields as to how to tell that excellent story. If you're stuck, brainstorm the issue and listen more to try to get at the story. I mentioned at the beginning that Nick was trying to get the story about health and conflict, and we traveled to so many villages and eventually found the story of a woman who was literally starving to death. The soldiers had come in and pillaged her town. Because she was a woman, she fed her kids and her husband and her parents first, and she was literally starving to death. And that was the story that he ended up writing about. And then practice, practice, practice. We have now so many different means of practicing the story in a way that we didn't have before. You can write your blog, you can promote organizations, you can submit op-eds. So many ways of becoming a good storyteller. So no excuses for not practicing this important aspect. So what does all of this tell us? Well, first of all, I hope that you're convinced that narrative is actually very important, to listen, really listen. I believe in the old adage that all politics is local, and therefore that all medicine is personal. That the only way that you can transform medical care is to start with the person in front of you. The only way you can make a difference in all your advocacy work is to start with the person in front of you. And so you will get better, practice getting and telling the story. And this is a gift that keeps on giving. It's something that helps your patients, assists with national and international advocacy. And I finally want to go back very quickly to our first 3 stories. Jerry the mechanic ended up being fine. He's the guy with the chest pain that was probably nothing. Unfortunately, though, he ended up getting a catheterization at some point because the doctor said, we don't know what's causing your chest pain. And he ended up having permanent heart damage as a result of a complication that happened. So remember that not listening can have bad consequences. Danielle, the college student who was told she needs a spinal tap, she got so scared as a result of being told all of this that she went to the bathroom, opened the window, and literally fled from the ER. She got so scared that she felt like she was trapped in that system and felt like the only way out was to run out the bathroom window. Not the ideal way of medical care. And finally, Sandy, the woman in my story who was misdiagnosed for over a year before she was diagnosed finally with metastatic cancer. Sandy was my mother. That's the reason I do what I do. Because I truly believe that all of us, especially if we have something bad happen in our lives like that, where there are misdiagnoses, because when there are things that we could have done differently, that there's a way to make it positive and to say, this is what I'm going to do now to try to change the system. And so I want to conclude by giving you my contact information. My websites are here. This is the book that I just wrote, When Doctors Don't Listen. And you can find me on Twitter. I would love to hear from you afterwards through email as well. And hear more in the break after and in the reception later, more about your experiences and all your advocacy work. And so I want to thank all of you for your time and attention, and thank you, Unite for Sight, again for having me here. Thank you all very much.